Hello, and thank you for joining us behind the science. Here we will connect you with Eurofins network, testing labs, and more broadly with the science of food testing in a way that you may not have experienced in the past from the viewpoint of the scientists themselves. So this conversation aims to zoom into a single anecdote of the Eurofins story. If the topic raises a question for you, feel free to submit it anytime throughout, or follow up with our presenters afterwards. We will, however, intend to keep this chat personal, but we'll follow up with you and your questions directly after. So our guest today is Mollie Van Alst, a Senior Analytical Services Manager within Eurofins Food Chemistry Testing Lab in Des Moines, Iowa. And our host, Eurofins Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Doug Marshall. Doug, I'm going to hand it right over to you for your conversation.
Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate everyone showing an interest in something a little different than what we normally do. You're all familiar with our technical webinars. We go into a deep dive into something technical that might be important to our customers. What the series is designed to be is more of a conversation about the people behind the science, those who are actually doing the testing. When you send in your sample, you trust us to be a shepherd of that sample. And it takes a lot of incredibly talented people to pull this off. And I thought it would be of interest to you to meet some of these individuals as we go along in the series and to have them share their story on why they appreciate your business, but also kind of some of the behind the scenes activities we do to make sure that your test results are the best test result you can get. And we're going to cover a lot of different scientific disciplines as we progress through the series. I'm incredibly lucky to have Mollie with us today because I depend on Mollie a great deal when I have questions related to nutritional testing. She is absolutely my go-to person, and she always comes through. And I know she does that with our customer base as well. So our conversation today is going to be wrapped around FDA's new designation of the use of the term healthy on nutritional labels and on package labels. And we have both spent way too much of our time trying to interpret what it takes for a customer of ours to feel confident using that term on their label. And so, Mollie, thank you very much for joining this and being willing to share your perspective on what you do for our customers. So if you wouldn't mind just starting off, give the audience a little bit of your background and how you wound up in this current seat you hold at Eurofins.
Yeah, for sure. So if you would have asked me like when I was a kid what I wanted to do, I would have told you I wanted to be like a chef or really anything other than what I'm doing right now. I never would have pictured myself doing what I'm doing today, but kind of a little backstory. I initially graduated from Iowa State. I have a BS in animal science and a minor in psychology. Don't ask me why I paired the two of those together, but I did. But before actually landing on animal science and graduating with that degree, I actually dabbled in more of kind of the artsy programs. I was very interested in architecture, interior design, and even music growing up. I'm from the Chicagoland area, so I considered a lot of schools in that area because they have really good arts programs. But Iowa State also has some well-established, architecture and interior design programs as well. So I would consider myself a pretty creative type person by nature, but I never really felt like any of those fields fit me as a person. So I didn't really have any clear direction once I started courses at Iowa State of what I wanted to do. And one of my friends in college made a joke and said, let's just bring up the Iowa State catalog and you can play eeny, meeny, miny, mo and see if you land on a major that you like. And again, it was kind of started off as a joke, but I landed on animal science and I had never really given that any consideration. I didn't really even know what it was But I thought to myself, I like puppies, I like kitties, I could be a veterinarian. So that's kind of the path that I started when I was, I think, probably my second semester of my freshman year. But I joined that program late, so I didn't actually get my first pick of classes. So that kind of left me stuck with some of those that didn't fill up quite as quickly, which was one in particular was a beef cattle science course, where if you don't know, it's basically about the science of, production beef cattle. And you would have 2 lectures a week and 1 practical lab a week. And I thought lab, like, we're in a lab. No. If you're not familiar with Iowa State, they're a big agricultural program. So they have farms within their network, things like that. So that was where our practicals were held. And a lot of my peers in that program, because many of them grew up in Iowa, they had exposure to farm life. They grew up on a farm. Their parents had a farm. They were familiar with these types of animals and livestock. And so I'll never forget that very first lab because our professor actually asked the group, who here is a city slicker? Who did not grow up in Iowa? And I very stupidly raised my hand, not really realizing what I was getting into. And so that very first lab was actually a demonstration on how to castrate a bull. So I was made as the example, the one to show the class how to do that, which never in my life would I thought I'd be doing that, but it was extremely fascinating from a standpoint of, why do we do the things that we do? And I started choosing more of those classes instead of focusing on the companion animals that I thought I was going to be, working with. So I started, getting into swine science, all of those types of things. And after graduation, I was fortunate enough to start a position with a well-known company in, meat production. And so I started as an associate in Waco, Texas, as one of their food safety and quality associates. And it was actually a turkey harvest facility. So think like Thanksgiving birds, things like that. But the unique thing about it was, and Doug, you probably can attest to this too from the micro side, is it was a much older facility. So we actually had the harvest facility for the birds on one side and literally separated by a concrete wall, just a concrete wall. The other side was fully cooked delicatessen, diced meat, things like that, which from a pathological contamination is yeah, no risk at all. They don't, to my knowledge, and you probably know better than me, I don't think they build facilities like that anymore. So it was very unique. So to say that, we had a really robust monitoring program would be an understatement. So I got a lot of exposure that way. And after some time, as an associate, they needed a laboratory manager for their in-house lab. And so I had the opportunity to actually manage that environmental monitoring program and work with quality and food safety operations and even USDA inspectors, which again kind of fueled my interest in why do we do what we do, but also exposed me to laboratory analysis in that and regulatory rules, which I thought was very interesting. So
I like the fact that you've walked more than a mile in the shoes of a typical Eurofins customer. I mean, you have the in-plant experience, you got your boots dirty, you recognize that, you're not working in a company that has the best facility in the world, but that experience, I think, is very informative on why you're so good at what you currently do.
Yes, I definitely feel like that was a good first stepping stone for me, because had I not worked in a production facility prior to working for Eurofins, I wouldn't understand as much as I understand, especially when it comes to clients needing things urgently or why something is important. especially from a regulatory standpoint. So I think that helped me kind of have a greater appreciation for those types of needs.
Okay, fantastic. So how did you get your first role at Eurofins?
So I was in Waco, Texas, which is a long way from home. I mentioned I'm from Chicago, went to school in Iowa. So I wanted to be closer to home, and I didn't necessarily want to go back to the Chicagoland area. I kind of felt like Iowa was more of a home, and still close to like my immediate family, within driving distance, of course. So I actually, I reached out, I started looking in Iowa for laboratory positions because that was where I had found my interest. And I saw that Eurofins had a location in Des Moines. We used to, for my in-house samples that we couldn't run in-house, especially for like pathogens, we would send them to Eurofins. So I kind of knew of them. And then I interviewed for a project manager position, which was in their customer service department. So more, again, exposure to the client side of things rather than me just being an internal lab rat, which also gave me a little bit more exposure as well. And I accepted the position, and I've been with the company for about 8 years now. And that kind of evolved from customer service. Now I'm our Senior Analytical Service Manager. And my primary focus is really nutrition labeling regulations and helping clients troubleshoot their results with respect to those regulations.
Okay, very good. So, nutritional labeling, I'll ask you a question. I'm not sure there's a good answer, but what's the size of that portfolio?
Oh, Lord.
Do you have any idea how many tests that department might perform for different analytical methods, for example?
It's a
And
great
again, there's
question.
no right answer. I'm just curious what the scope of that must look like.
No, it's a great question because the scope actually depends on more than just the core nutrients that the FDA requires. So if you're marketing your product in a certain way to a certain audience, adding claims like organic or natural, things like that, your scope gets bigger and bigger. So if you're I would say if you're simply making a product and you want to meet the bare minimum requirements, you're looking at about 15 tests, which a lot of people, if they are new to the food industry, they say, I want a nutrition test. I'm like, okay, well, that means a lot. So you're looking at about 15 tests, which is, when you go into your pantry and you look at the nutrition facts panel, that's what that encompasses. So we're running all the tests that are basically determined by the FDA to have significance when it comes to consumer education of what they're putting in their bodies.
Okay. So if I'm a Eurofins customer and I come to you and I say, hey, I want to be able to use the term healthy on my label. Do they have to do all of those tests, or how do we get to the point where I could put that on my package label and the money will come flowing in because the customer's going to think it's a fantastic and healthy product?
Yeah, so another great question, super relevant because of the FDA's efforts now with their final rule for the definition of healthy. I think if you don't know, if you're not in the food industry and you're not, actively working with these products, a lot of times healthy can mean different things to different people. And so it was important for the FDA to, one, not only establish a definition, but update their current definition. So if you're looking to, market your product as healthy, previously that definition was actually established like in the 1990s. So the regulations that we've had up until this point were quite old, and they were based on 3 major components. So that would be the product had to fall below a certain threshold for your total and saturated fat and cholesterol. You also had to be high in fiber. And then you also had to have a high content of some of the micronutrients, whether that be A, C, iron, calcium, those types of things. And then, of course, they wanted you to be below a threshold for sodium. That was the original definition. It was much more simple than what they came up with. And the funny thing is, it's funny to me now, but it wasn't funny to me at the time. Back in maybe November, December of last year, I did a webinar for Eurofins on the proposed rule that FDA had put out for the healthy definition. And literally, I think it was only 2 or 3 days later after I did that webinar, they finalized the rule after it had been pending for like 2 years and made significant changes. So I had spent all that time learning, what they were proposing with the expectation that some things might change. But at the time, it was maddening. Now it's a little more funny. But to give you kind of an update, and I think this is where people struggle, the new criteria is beneficial, but it sounds more simple than it actually is. And that's because they're not, a lot of the things that are in our diets today are not just single ingredients, right? They're combination foods, mixed products, meal kits, things like that. And so the FDA's new criteria, while it is updated and helpful, if you're a producer of something other than a single ingredient, the regulations actually become that more complex. So what they did is they stuck with the same idea of limiting nutrients, right? But they removed cholesterol and total fat, which makes sense. Today we know not all fats are bad. There's healthy fats, good fats, same with cholesterol, that'll, do the opposite of contributing to heart disease, right? The good fats will help lower your risk for things like stroke and heart disease. So they left saturated fat in there, which we all know to be.
This is fantastic news for me because I had bacon and a donut for breakfast this morning.
No.
Are those two foods on the healthy list?
No. Those would be high in saturated fats, which are the bad fats, those that contribute to raising your blood pressure, heart disease, stroke. So think like avocados or olive oil or nuts, certain nuts and legumes. They're typically higher fat products, but they're more concentrated in those unsaturated fats, which is like your omega-3s and omega-6s, the good stuff.
So fat is now good, right? That was a change in their definition of healthy.
Yes, some fat is good.
Oh, just some fat is good. Okay.
Yeah. The original restriction was just too broad. So it limited a lot of those foods. Like, believe it or not, because of the old requirements, like water, something as simple as water couldn't bear a healthy claim because, one of those requirements was it had to be high in fiber. Well, we know unless you're fortifying your water with fiber, which to me would be quite gross and probably gelatinous, it can't bear the claim. So things that were routinely regarded as healthy couldn't actually bear that claim.
So there's a product on the market called vitamin water. I can see there's an entrepreneur out there thinking, cellulose powder water as a way to improve I guess water in and of itself is considered healthy. But if you added fiber, it would be more healthy.
Yeah, the FDA's new criteria doesn't talk about fiber, and that was actually one of the controversies that people had because they think that, we should be focusing more on fiber as a part of our health. But their stance really was just that if you focus on these nutrient-dense foods and limiting these 3 ingredients, the other beneficial nutrients will come with that profile. It's focusing on the overall nutritional profile. So by default, if you're targeting a healthy diet, you would be getting more of fiber.
Okay. I'm just curious. So you work a lot with our customers, but you also work with the technical talent at the bench, doing the chemistry tests necessary to support a healthy label claim. And you mentioned, some of the analytical tests that you would perform. And I'm just curious if you could tell our audience, is there one particular test that, is the most challenging either to, perform on the bench or to help a customer understand what the results mean for them?
Yeah. The good thing is with respect to the healthy claim, the limiting nutrients, those tests are actually quite rudimentary and easy. So when you're looking at what they have is the saturated fat, as well as sodium. It's a pretty routine test. And then added sugars, that's actually contrary to what people might think, not something that we can analytically determine. You have to determine that from your formulation. There's not simply put, there's not a test that can tell you what sugar in a product was naturally occurring and what was added, especially if it's a complex good. So that's something that a manufacturer has to have record keeping. But when it comes to supporting maybe other claims that might support that overall nutritional beneficial profile that the FDA is trying to target, I would say dietary fiber is up there. And that's for two primary reasons, I would say, and that would be methodology limitations, as well as regulatory limitations, which, if you know anything about dietary fiber, those two things don't jive very well. A lot of the dietary fiber methods are subtraction based. And so what that just means is we're just removing everything with chemicals or enzymes. We are stripping everything away from a sample that's not dietary fiber in the hopes that what we are leaving is only fiber, and then quantifying that. Well, regulatory definitions don't go by the chemical science of things. FDA, for those that don't know, they have their own definition of what we consider dietary fiber, which is when you're looking at a nutrition facts panel and it says dietary fiber, you have to meet the FDA's definition to put in that value, which doesn't always jive with the analytical science. They are basing their definition off of what we know to be beneficial in your gut, improve digestion, improve health, which the methodologies don't care about that. They care about what chemicals and enzymes we're using to remove. So I think from an interpretation standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint, if you're trying to market your product as having high fiber, which is something that people really focus on being healthy, you have a lot of hurdles to overcome, because you have to, one, find the most appropriate method, and two, you have to make sure it meets the FDA's definition, which often doesn't go very well.
So this sounds like it really requires a consultative effort between the laboratory and the customer, both
100%.
to define what the customer really needs, to make sure that the analytical portfolio can deliver a data point or two that meets those needs, and then lastly, how to interpret an analytical report that might be in a language that a customer doesn't speak. And so that's where you come in as that really key component between a customer ask and a laboratory's ability to deliver. So,
Correct.
we would love to have nothing but robots in our laboratories, but what a robot misses is a consultative ability. Now, maybe AI will change that completely. Who knows? But we have, thousands and thousands of customers making thousands and thousands of different SKUs that all have all kinds of different components and customer needs. So this has been very, very educational for me to learn how something I thought initially was kind of simple to do. I got the mass subtraction, what's left is the stuff that's not digestible, but it was much more complicated. Okay. Um, So, are there any new tests that the nutrition group has come up with lately that uh, has been helpful either to the laboratorians or helpful to our customers? And it
Yeah.
doesn't necessarily have to be in the healthy space, but just in the nutritional testing space.
Yeah, and actually, so something that comes to the forefront of my mind, and this is not so much on human food, but pet food, and this is a little outside of my technical scope of expertise, but that's neither here nor there, is we actually developed at our lab two methods that are now in production, one for glucosamine and one for chondroitin. Um, and the reason I understand it to be pretty significant is that the methods that were kind of available originally didn't really expand to enough matrices, especially now that, like, if you have a pet at home, when you go to the pet store, you're seeing all of these different supplements and all of these different types of dog and cat foods that market joint mobility and those types of things, which glucosamine and chondroitin actually play a pretty important role in supporting that. So the methods that we developed at our lab, which are now in production and can be sold to our clients, is geared more towards those matrices because there was such a high demand for it. So we're pretty excited to see kind of, those flourish and what comes of those. I know our team has worked really hard for a really long time on those methods as well. So yeah.
Thank you. As an old dog personally, I'm happy to see that
You could benefit.
there are some things out there that maybe I should be consuming to give me a better quality of life. So
Now, I'm not advocating that you go out and buy dog treats that are meant for.
well, they are cheap, they're healthy. Maybe they'll work for me. I'll let you know. Um, Here's an interesting question. I have a very long list of my own. I'm sure you have the same. But do you have, can you give us some examples of frequent customer questions that come across your desk? And, if it's at a high frequency, that tells me something that either we're not doing a good job, and I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about us at Eurofins. We're not doing a good enough job communicating to our customer base up front what the answer is. But number two, it also tells us that what our customers are struggling with, and can we come up with solutions to help them better manage their work life? So again,
Yeah.
frequently asked questions.
Yeah, when you say the word frequently asked question, I think of one particular topic that I probably deal with at least one time a week. And I think kind of along the lines of your questions, it's not necessarily something that I think Eurofins could be doing better, but our regulatory bodies could be informing better and staying more current with. And so what comes to mind, and bear with me here, it'll make more sense after I explain, but when you send us a product for testing, for full nutritional testing, and you want a nutrition facts panel, there is a chance that your dietary fiber and or your sugars could exceed the carbohydrates that we report to you. Yes. Now, for those that don't know, dietary fiber, yeah, for Doug, dietary fiber and sugars are both types of carbs, right? That's what the consumer expectation is. So you would not expect either one of those things or both of them summed together to exceed your carbohydrates. That just doesn't make sense. Especially if you look at a nutrition facts panel. Carbohydrates is there, and then slightly indented underneath is fiber and sugars, which is showing you that these are carbohydrate components. So I've seen this so many times now, and we, initially when this was occurring, more infrequently, we kind of didn't have a great understanding of what the root cause was. Well, if you think about foods in the market supply now, there's a lot of novel matrices and plant-based protein products, right? There's been an increase in emphasis on these plant-based proteins, whether that be for health reasons or sustainability purposes. We are seeing a lot more of those types of products. So the issue that we found with a lot of those products actually lies with protein. And now you're probably thinking, that doesn't make any sense. What does my protein have to do with dietary fiber, sugars, and carbohydrates? So what we found, and again, bear with me, the FDA is really our limiting factor here, right? So the regulations for nutrition labeling, while they have evolved recently, they haven't evolved quite enough to accommodate for some of these matrices. So if I were to go to the Code of Federal Regulations, we'll start with carbohydrates. They tell us this is a calculated value. There is no test. We cannot test total carbohydrates. What we have to do is they say you test your macronutrients, so your protein, your moisture, your fat, and your ash, and you subtract all of that from 100, and what's left is your carbs. Okay, so just put a pin in that for a second. The FDA also says that we have to determine protein by acceptable AOAC methods, or typically protein combustion. That test is also not testing protein. That test is testing for nitrogen. And then the FDA says we have to use a conversion factor of 6.25 for most products to take that nitrogen we quantify, multiply it by the factor, and that's your protein. There are a few exceptions, dairy, certain grains that have different factors, but in general, that is what we have to use. Now, going back to the carbohydrates formulation. So we have found that that blanket 6.25 factor doesn't fit all of these plant-based novel matrices. This is only one way to determine protein. We can do an internal check by running amino acids to calculate a truer value for protein. And if you remember from high school chemistry, they always said protein, the building blocks of protein is amino acids, right? Well, the building blocks of amino acids is nitrogen. So that's why they use nitrogen to determine protein, because it's a very quick way of going about that. So if we look at the amino acids and we calculate a truer value for protein, we're often finding that that 6.25 factor is just a little bit too high for these protein, plant-based protein matrices. So if you go back to the carbs formula, if your protein value that you calculate is too high, carbs is 100 minus moisture, fat, ash, and protein. If that value is too high, or any of those are too high, by default, your carbohydrates are going to be lower than expected. That confuses a lot of people because dietary fiber and sugars are their own independent analyses. We do not factor them into the carbohydrates calculation, even though they are carbohydrates. So this is something that we found having to explain to clients a lot more with just the new trends in the market, the move towards healthier foods, and it's completely counterintuitive. And again, it kind of goes along the lines of, I don't know that it's something Eurofins can maybe do better, because we now have done the work to figure out, where the root cause lies. But in that, we need our regulatory agencies to start acknowledging some of these data, some of these discrepancies, because 6.25 is proving to be, less and less relevant.
So, so what you're telling me is it's a math issue with the methods that are regulatory expected that the labs perform. And so when you do look at that label, I've done this on a few times, and the math just doesn't work. I've always been curious. This just doesn't make sense to me. And with your explanation, It makes sense to me. So thank you. I can easily understand why this would be at the top of your FAQ list.
Yes.
Do you have any others to share?
I mean, I'm sure I could think of some, but as soon as you asked that question, that was the very first thing that popped into my mind, just because I deal with it so routinely now, and it's such a frustration. I think it's a frustration not only for our clients, but for us as a lab, because we are bound by the regulations, especially since we make nutrition facts panels for our clients based on results. We can't use an alternative factor, unless the FDA says that we can. And so it's, I think, helpful for our clients to understand too, like we understand your frustration, because we have the exact same frustration.
Got it. So this is kind of a question that you can't answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You're welcome. And it's kind of related to, we've touched a little bit on the regulatory environment dictates a lot of what we have to do as a testing laboratory. And sometimes the methods may not be the best methods in the marketplace, the best methods that scientists are cooking up. But if we kind of separate the conversation a little bit away from the term healthy, what kind of other future things do you think you're going to see coming down the road in terms of nutritional analysis? You talked about, some of the supplements and pet food as an example, but you just got some ideas on where this is going in the future.
Yeah, I love this question because number one, you're right. There is no accurate way to answer it. So anything I say could be valid here. But I think when I think about, what's in the works, what's, in this space of testing, is I think the general consensus among most people and our administration is that, there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's going to depend on a lot of different things. But the one thing to me that stands out, and this is even separate from the healthy claim, but I think overall health is becoming more of a focus for Americans and the current administration. And I'm saying this regardless of approach, regardless of different opinions on what testing or what, not testing, but what, implementations and changes that we need to make or what we should prioritize first and how to go about those. I think regardless of anyone's opinions on what specific things need to come first and what we do, health is at the forefront. And that's oftentimes, to your point, aside from just nutrition testing or nutrition labeling. One of the things that comes to mind is this week, literally, they announced that they're going to start phasing out petroleum-based dyes. So you think like Red 40, right? I guarantee if you're not the typical consumer that goes and, buys vegan foods or dye-free or artificial-free foods, I guarantee if you go to your pantry right now, you will find at least one, if not several items that contain Red 40 or any other dye. It's actually, interestingly enough, my mother-in-law gave me a hummingbird feeder for Christmas, and the weather's getting nicer in Iowa, so I put that out this weekend. And it's along with it, she just gave me like a commercial sugar mix that's meant for hummingbirds. And I followed the instructions, mixed it with water, and I noticed that it was red. And so I looked at the ingredient statement, and it was, table sugar, things that you would normally think, citric acid for like preservative reasons, and Red 40. We're even giving our
Do you think hummingbirds like beet juice?
Maybe, Doug. It's just interesting to me, and it emphasizes that, I think aside from nutrition testing, there's going to be a lot more changes that impact the health or overall health of our nation, of our society. So yeah, along with that, I mean, there's other things that come to mind. The FDA's front of packaging labeling proposal. So that's not finalized. That just came out. They're talking about, you know, at a glance signals on a package to indicate whether or not something is healthier or part of a beneficial diet. So aside.
So if a consumer sees 2 thumbs up, that means it's okay. If it's 1 down and 1 up, it be cautious, and if it's 2 thumbs down, avoid.
Well, Doug, they have not decided on a symbol yet, so you could submit that to them as your idea.
I submitted a lot of them already.
Yeah, that is their next step, is determining a symbol. So I like it. 2 thumbs up. Caution, take caution.
Yeah. That would be easy enough for me to understand.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure in ancient Roman times that thumbs up actually meant not okay and thumbs down meant okay, but you know, modern interpretation is the opposite. So
It could be worse.
okay. Um, so I've learned a lot as we kind of wrap up our hour here, Mollie. What is the most rewarding part or your favorite aspect of sitting in this role at Eurofins?
Yeah. So I really enjoy learning, which I feel like is a cliche answer, but after I learn something, I also really enjoy educating others. And so whether that be internally, like for my colleagues, or externally, you know, like webinars like this, or discussions like this, I am not, regardless of what you might say, Doug, I am not a scientist by nature, right? I kind of evolved into this role. And so I feel like that actually puts me in a very unique position to empathize with our clients that maybe that are similar to me, don't have a technical background. And I feel as though it gives me the opportunity to explain things in more colloquial, common terms for people to understand. I think everybody recognizes that Eurofins is a business, right? You know, we need to make money just like every other company out there, but more importantly, we really do care that our results are meaningful, and that's something that I've always aligned with, and that I find rewarding when I'm helping a client. It literally brings me absolutely no joy to sell something to a client that either they can't understand, or you know, it ends up not being meaningful to them. It doesn't provide them with the answers they were seeking. So I think that's probably the most rewarding part, is when we do get it right and we do find a way to help the client. And there are those cases where we may not always know the answer and we may not always have the right immediate solution, but when you work with us and myself, you know that we're going to try to at least get you in the right direction.
Fantastic. Well, Mollie, I really do appreciate this conversation with you, as always. You are a superstar, and our customers, I know, are incredibly well served with your presence. And to the audience members, again, this is our first try on this kind of format. So if you wouldn't mind giving back a little bit to us with some comments and some suggestions, we would really value your opinion, because as this evolves, we want to make this engaging. We want to make it a little bit fun. We want to make it a little bit technical. And in my humble opinion, I think we've succeeded on this first go around, but I know we can do better next time. And I'm looking forward, Mollie, to having you back soon. And Scott, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to close this out.
All right. Well, nothing really more from me, Doug. Mollie, thank you both. This was, yeah, I thought this was the first go that turned out pretty well. And so I see there's a few questions or comments in our chat. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go into those, but we'll certainly follow up with you all afterwards and make sure that you get the responses and can keep the conversation going with Mollie and or Doug as well. So at a personal level. So I appreciate you both, and I appreciate everybody for coming along. So we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.